The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and today I'm joined by China Global South's Francophone Africa editor Geraud Neema, joining us on the line from beautiful Mauritius. A very good afternoon to you, Geraud.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Geraud, all week this week, and even into last week, I've been getting a lot of email from our readers saying, why aren't we doing more on the coup in Niger? You've been hearing this as well. People are frustrated that there's a lot of discussion going on about the impact for France and Russia and even the United States in this, and that at the same time, there's not a lot of discussion going on about China. And so people are saying, why aren't we having more coverage? And the problem for us is that there just isn't a lot to cover when it comes to the Chinese response here, because the Chinese have been characteristically tight-lipped about everything that's been going on. So today, we're going to have a discussion to try and elaborate on the politics, the strategy, and what's going on with the Chinese in Niger. Now, for those of you who have not been following this issue very closely, just to bring you up to speed, soldiers from the country's presidential guard last month on July 26th seized power and detained President Mohamed Bazoum. They are in control of the country as of this broadcast here this week. And again, there is a lot of talk about Ecowas, which is the West African regional group, making an intervention, militarily intervene to put Bazoum back into power. There's a lot of condemnation from around the world. China, for its part, has been relatively quiet. But let me give you a little bit of background on China's role in Niger, just as a setup for our conversation today, Geraud. China is the country's second largest investor behind France, mostly in the oil and the uranium mining sectors. The best estimates that we have right now are that China's total FDI is somewhere around $2.5 billion to $3 billion. Now, some of those investments include an oil refinery joint venture between PetroChina and the government in the southern city of Zinder. That outputs around 20,000 barrels a day, largely for the domestic market. Now, the Chinese are also looking at exporting oil for the international market, and that has to do with a PetroChina joint venture on the 2,000-kilometer Niger to Benin pipeline. Now, this is an absolutely critical investment and something to watch that could have an impact by the coup. So as of February, this is the last update that we received on this, the pipeline was about two-thirds done, and they said that they expected it to be complete by the end of the year. And this is a potential game changer for the Nigerian government to be able to export vast quantities of oil through this pipeline via Benin. Total investment in the project, when the second phase begins, could reach as high as $4 billion, just to give you a sense of what's at stake there. Now, in the uranium sector, the China National Nuclear Corporation entered into a joint venture with the government to develop the Azalik mine in central Niger. Even though Niger has some of the world's highest grade uranium and about 5% of the world's total reserves, the Chinese halted their JV with the government back in 2015, and I couldn't find any information to see if it's up and running again. I'd be interested, Geraud, to see if you've heard anything on that. But those are the two main areas where the Chinese are invested today. And again, these are very important deals, and the coup at the same time, particularly for the oil pipeline, could have a very big impact. Now, let's talk about the diplomatic response to the coup. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued its first statement on the issue on August 3rd, where it was a very bland statement, exactly what you would expect from the Chinese in a situation like this, where they called on Chinese nationals to shelter in place and said it was closely monitoring the safety of both Chinese personnel and institutions in the country. This is exactly the same language that we heard following the coup in Burkina Faso and in other disturbances elsewhere in Africa. Again, right now, they've been par for the course. That same day, also on August 3rd, they published a separate statement expressing support for President Bazoum and said that he's a friend of China and they hope his personal safety is ensured. They also added, and let me quote here, We believe Niger and other countries in the region have the wisdom and capability to find a political solution to the current situation. Again, all of that is standard language for the Chinese. African solutions for African problems, that's a long-standing mantra that the Chinese have. And also the Chinese tend to prefer the powers that are in power. So their support for President Bazoum was, again, something very predictable. The last thing that we heard from the Chinese on this issue, again, this is the last statement, nothing else has been said about it, came earlier this week when the embassy in Niamey said it was time for Chinese nationals who could leave the country to do so. It was time to get out. So far, though, as of where we are now, there is no discussion of any kind of rescue operation like what we saw earlier this year in Sudan, and we haven't heard anything about Chinese forces in Djibouti or elsewhere being put on standby. So no rescue operation right now has been mobilized for Chinese nationals in Niamey or elsewhere in Niger, but the embassy has said, you know what, if you can get out, get out. Now, Geraud, you and I were talking earlier about the differences in the response that the Chinese government had to the coup in Niger and to what happened last year when the Ghanaian government was also overthrown by the military government. As I've noted, China is usually pretty quiet on these kinds of things, as they've been with Niger. That is, again, right out of their playbook, because if they comment a lot on the situation, then a lot of people could construe it as a potential violation of their longstanding non-interference doctrine, like they're meddling in another country's internal affairs. But they didn't do that in Guinea. And it caught a lot of us by surprise when the foreign ministry openly called for the return of deposed President Alpha Condé.
我们密切关注几内亚形势发展，注意到非盟。
We're closely following the situation in Guinea. China opposes the coup and calls for the immediate release of President Alpha Condé. We call on and hope all parties can remain calm, bear in mind the fundamental interests of Guinea and its people, resolve relevant issues through dialogue and consultation, and safeguard domestic peace and stability.
So did you hear what he said, where he said, we oppose the coup? That was interesting. Again, we haven't heard that before, and we're not hearing that in the Niger case. But Geraud, let's start there. Why do you think that the Chinese response to the recent coup in Niger was different than what we heard from Wang Wenbing about Guinea?
It's pretty much quite straightforward because you said it earlier. The coup in Niger, the reaction is really straight from China playbook when it comes to reacting on every coup happening or any political turmoil happening in any other countries. They stand by the principle of non-interference. We do hope that the involved party will gonna find a way to solve the issue peacefully, but we won't, take position on that. But in Guinea, they went a bit further than that. They went on opposing clearly the situation, just because in Guinea, they had a lot in stake. They had the bauxite and iron project that's still the Simandou project that's on the pipeline, a very major project for China on a geopolitical scale, because those two projects, the bauxite and the iron project in Simandou, it represents an alternative to China to free itself from Australia iron and from Indonesia and Brazil bauxite, giving them a much more leverage in the relationship with Australia. Especially at that time, you remember it was September 2022, and the relations were really bad with Australia. So you could kind of understand, you could even feel the anxiety that China had because they didn't know what was going to happen and how it's going to unfold later on. And later on, when we saw the new regime in Guinea, how they behaved, you kind of feel that China had kind of a certain reason to be kind of worried about how things unfolded. So yeah, it's more about the geopolitics that's on the map and what really China has to gain or to risk in the situation. In the case of Niger, we don't see really much of like a situation where China is going to feel the need to go out of his way to oppose the coup, as we saw that in Guinea.
So in your thinking here, just let me see if I understand here, it's the fact that the resources in Niger and Guinea are different that guided or informed the response. And because oil is not really an important commodity for the Chinese when it comes to Africa, because a bulk of oil buying now for the Chinese has shifted now to the Middle East, Russia, Brazil, and even to some extent the United States. Africa now provides less than 10% of China's imported oil. Again, uranium, they had that deal. It's been stalled for almost 10 years. But again, uranium can be something that's sourced from a number of different places, so they don't really need Niger. So in that case, they said, okay, whatever. However, Guinea has the iron ore and the bauxite that they hate the fact that they're dependent on Australia for. And even though today relations between Australia and China appear to be improving, and again, I say appear because this is happening on multiple tracks where on the one hand, the Chinese have just taken down the tariffs on barley, but on the other hand, there is growing tension about Australia's involvement in U.S.-led military initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. So again, this is happening on two different tracks, and we may see a resumption of some of the tensions that we saw last year. But for now, things are getting better. But in your view, Geraud, so it's that question of the resources that guides the responses.
Exactly. It's more a question of the resources and how important is Niger to China. In the current context, China has no incentive to go out of its way to be more vocal about what's happening in Niger. Because also keep in mind that even though they said in the statement that President Bazoum was China's friend and they had contact, and also to address the question that you raised before to kind of know where they were standing on the uranium discussion, the last time they had discussion about uranium was June 27 this year when a delegation of China, the China Nuclear Company, were in Niger to talk about that, to see how they're going to resume that project. So yeah, they had contact with Niger, but it was not to the extent to feel the need to go really to push further in a way that to oppose the coup. And let's keep in mind that for China, keeping that neutral position, especially since the new regime doesn't sound to be anti-China, gives them options. If Bazoum is out for good, they're still going to be able to continue to do business with the new regime. But if Bazoum is back, they're still also going to continue to do business with Bazoum. So for them, it's like, let's just keep our options open without, antagonizing any of the party involved.
And that's a really important point because in all of the coups in the Sahel and in West Africa, and even in Sudan as well, the Chinese have been a neutral entity here. So none of the military coup plotters and the people who've taken over power have had a gripe with the Chinese. They haven't come out openly opposed about the Chinese in any way. In fact, it sounds like as soon as they came into power, they wanted to do business with the Chinese. Whereas you see open opposition to the French and even to some extent the Americans.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so in some sense, there's a geopolitical play here. And again, when we were looking at Guinea, for example, we're wondering, okay, what's going to happen to their investments? And it turned out that the Chinese were in negotiations with the military government within days of them assuming power. And at the end of the day, this reaffirms that Chinese foreign policy in these kinds of situations is ultimately pragmatic and not ideological in any way.
Exactly. It's very pragmatic, opportunistic, I would even say, because it's more of like, we don't want to antagonize anybody. We need to be pragmatic in the way things are approaching. That's why they use the phrase by saying that we count on the wisdom of the party involved in the country and in the region to find a peaceful way out of this crisis. It's just to tell you that, we do hope that you do find a solution. And the idea, and even now, since we are talking about the idea of having a military intervention from Ecowas, that's kind of put China in a certain position where they say, maybe we should tell our people, our citizens present in Niger, if they can leave the country, maybe they can leave the country. But still, even there, you don't feel the sense of urgency that we saw that when it happened in Sudan, for instance. It's more of like they kind of evaluate the situation on the basis that it's still manageable. The crisis didn't get the point where they really feel the need to evacuate the citizen on the ground.
It's still not clear if ECOWAS is going to have the capabilities to launch a multinational intervention in Niger to remedy the situation. And that does present China with an interesting conflict here, because on the one hand, though, they've said African solutions for African problems, right? I mean, that's been one of their long-standing things. However, it should be noted that the Chinese have a long-standing resistance and they just hold their noses at multinational interventions in other countries. It's something they detest, and they hate it when the Americans do it, and they hate it when it's done elsewhere, because there is this long-standing, deep-seated insecurity that one day the world could do this to China or to a Chinese territory. And they don't want anything multinational involved with the Taiwan issue. So here we have a situation where they may say African solutions to African problems and may not actually like what the solution is if ECOWAS is able to mobilize a force to get on the ground in Niger. That does present them with an interesting dilemma.
Yes, if ECOWAS do intervene in Niger, now China is kind of on the fence because we are talking about sovereignty here. The principle of China of non-interference in other countries' business is based really on the idea of protecting each country's sovereignty. So as much as they call African solution for African problem, in this case, that would be like more Niger's solution for Niger's problem. If we can avoid a war, if we can avoid a military confrontation, yeah, that's going to be good for us. But I don't see China going into the direction of even supporting or even, supporting in any way the ECOWAS military intervention if it does happen in Niger. So far, we've seen the discussion going on, and we can only bet that China is hoping that a peaceful solution may be found in that crisis. And that peaceful solution does not mean that China would say, if Bazoum doesn't come back to power, we are unhappy. No, it'd be like, okay, whatever peaceful solution you find in that crisis, Bazoum be back or not, we're going to be fine with that as long as it's peaceful and it is like you find a consensus around that.
You know, there's an old saying that if your enemy is, and I'm going to misquote this to some extent, but if your enemy is going to shoot themselves in the foot, let them shoot themselves in their foot. And not that France is China's enemy by any measure, but the Chinese have been late in coming into West Africa and extending the same kind of influence and engagement in West Africa or Francophone Africa that they've done in other parts of Africa, namely Lusophone Africa and Anglophone Africa. But now, for the most part, the Chinese are much more aggressive in going into French-speaking countries. And part of the reason over the years that they've delayed or been apprehensive about going into Western Africa and French-speaking countries is because they felt at a disadvantage that French influence for a long time was deeply embedded. Many of the laws in African countries are still based on Napoleonic Code. And the Chinese felt at a disadvantage that they just didn't have the cultural touch points, the skills, and the French influence was dominant. Now, one of the things that we've seen in all of these coups in recent years in the Sahel and in Francophone countries is this just bitter resentment of the French. I mean, the depths of resentment that people have in Africa towards the French cannot be overstated. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's lived in France for a long time and was the editor-in-chief of a French news network for a couple of years, they are in denial in France about how much people hate them. They have these own fantasy narratives that they think that they're still relevant and French culture is still, sought after. And it's just bizarre, the disconnect between what French people in France tell themselves and what people in Africa and even other parts of the world think of the French. And so when we look at this, I think the Chinese, looking at the situation, seeing the French in retreat in many parts of West Africa, see this as ultimately a benefit for them because when the dust settles, they're going to have more room to maneuver with the French diminished.
Exactly. It offers them a certain opportunity. Any situation where France now might be at the problem or maybe at odds with the new regime that's taking power in those countries, for China is just an opportunity. And that's why they're adopting a certain position where we're not supporting or we're not against. We're just giving us option to move ahead with that. So the situation with France in those regions is very difficult because we see how much they're kind of struggling to remain relevant. When it happened in Guinea, it happened in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and everything there, we could see the tension, we could see the stress that we're feeling. And now that is happening in Niger, we can see much more how, first of all, on the continent, when you read social media in Africa, how many people are, pushing and, praising the coup, even though personally, I do oppose the coup. I even do oppose the anti-French narrative that's kind of born out of the coup in Niger, because when you look at the context how the coup happened, you just realize that the anti-French narrative became just an opportunistic way for the new regime to garner African support and support within Niger. But that being said, that resentment that Africans are expressing toward France should lead France to kind of now to reassess its position in Africa, to reassess its foreign policy in those regions, and to see how they're going to move forward with that. Because the way things are going, the situation might get even worse than that it was before. And when they leave the places, a country like China would take advantage of that, of course.
Well, it's funny you talk about this need for the French to reassess their role in Africa. 94 French senators also felt that way this week as well, and they wrote an open letter to President Emmanuel Macron in Le Figaro, which is one of the major French national dailies, condemning the government's foreign policy in Africa and really lamenting the loss of power and influence, specifically in the Sahel, where the backlash against Paris has been noticeably strong, but really across Africa writ large. I mean, so this letter, I'd like to get your take on it. Let me just read a few quotes from it just to give everybody a sense of what was said. Here's what the senators wrote. Today, the France-Afrique of yesterday, and I think it's fascinating that they even use the phrasing France-Afrique, given how offensive that is to many people, but let's go with that. Today, the France-Afrique of yesterday has been replaced by the military Russe-Afrique, the economic Chine-Afrique, or the diplomatic America-Afrique. Isn't it time to review our vision of Africa and its link with France? The letter ended by saying that Africa is a friend, but no longer seems to understand France and is increasingly contesting its role and its larger presence. And they ended, this is the final words, "We are not resigned to our gradual disappearance from the entire continent." First, Geraud, what was your reaction when you read that letter?
I'd say it's quite legitimate as any major global power to be worried about how much of influence you're losing in different parts of the world, especially in the case of France, you're losing it in Africa. Africa that was for a long time, Francophone Africa, West Africa and Sahel region, that was for a long time France's backyard. So when you see over the years how you've been losing influence, you've been losing your presence there in that region, you kind of become worried. And the interesting part in their letter, they're not only focusing on anti-France feeling toward Russia, it's just more like we are worried about the US presence, we are worried about the Chinese presence, we're worried about the Russian presence. So basically, it's not like us France being against anything that's West. It's like we're just against anything that's not French in that region. So yes, for me, it's kind of legitimate for them to express that feeling. But also when I read that, when they say we need to reassess our France-Afrique relation, I really wonder what they have in mind. Because so far, different French presidents has come into power. Many of them, Sarkozy, Hollande, Macron, have been saying the same sentence over and over. We need to reassess our France-Afrique. But surprisingly, over the last 15 years, that reassessment never brought something new. And over the years, people only grew resentful against France in those regions. So when they say that, the question is, how do they perceive that new approach? How do they reassess that France-Afrique in those countries? Let's see how it's going to play out so far.
So President Macron has made it a priority to visit the continent quite a bit, and he's done so. And interestingly, Macron, more than Sarkozy or Chirac or any of the previous presidents, he's gone to Anglophone Africa, he's gone to Angola, far beyond the traditional spheres of French influence in Africa, trying to broaden the relationship. It hasn't really worked, in part because he keeps getting stumbled up on this question of accountability from the colonial era, particularly in places like Algeria and Morocco, where he's been asked over and over again to apologize for France's behavior during the colonial period. And his domestic politics at home prevent him from having that frank conversation. And that has fueled so much of the tension between North Africa and France. And then we saw in the riots earlier this year that took place in Paris, so much of the animosity that now is building inside French society between, say, a nativist xenophobic population that's developing, and that's really, a core part of the Marine Le Pen, the right wing, and at the same time, an ethnic minority population that's locked in the suburbs that feels completely alienated and isolated from French society. And again, so much of this comes down to race and language and culture, and that too has complicated the relationship with the continent. But for those people who are new to this issue and may not be following the frustrations that Africans have had going back decades, if not centuries, with the French. Help us understand a little bit what the core of the problem is. Why is there so much acidity on the part of so many in Francophone Africa towards the French, and to some extent less the Belgians, which is always interesting to me in the Congo, but specifically towards the French?
Exactly. The Belgium in Congo, it's a very different kind of story. So the relationship is also different. But for West Africa, for former colonies of France, it's more rooted from the colonial era where France had a huge influence in those regions. And later on, the behavior that France had after independence, many dictatorship that took place, that took power in those regions were supported and helped by France. Any nationalistic leader that kind of rose up was either killed or ousted of power with French support, because at that time there were many French military bases in those regions, and those military played a major role into either supporting, either crushing any opposition to the regime that was there. And since many citizens were not happy about how the regime were working, how those regime governing the country. And of course, when they see France supporting those regimes, the resentment they had against French kept on growing. To that, you add the fact, the economic element of the common currency, the franc CFA. That currency that so far, it's still like many are seeing it as the root cause of, economic problem that many Western African countries, French African countries are experiencing, because they say we don't have our own currency. Our currency is pegged with the euro that's now controlled by France. Our currency is printed in France. We cannot control anything. So we are not really independent. All those narratives mixed up with the bad governance of those regimes on the ground just boiled up to the feeling that everything that's happening in our countries, it's because of France. That's why we need French out. That's why any regime now, we see that in Burkina Faso, in Mali, any regime that comes into power, any coup plotter that comes into power, as soon as it says, I'm against France, I'm turning to Russia, everyone says, yes, you are welcome. They forget everything. They don't even question the legitimacy of the coup. As long as you say, I'm against France, it's done. You're good to go. And that's the context where you see the anti-France feeling that's burning and that's keep on growing in Western African Francophone countries.
Have you ever wondered how it's possible that in all of these countries, within 24 hours of the coup, there are these beautiful, perfectly clean Russian flags that just mysteriously appear everywhere? It's just remarkable to me. Whoever's the Russian flag distributor, my guess is it's the FSB, but let's just, whoever's the Russian flag distributor in West Africa is doing an excellent job, because I am just amazed at how those flags appear. And we saw that in the Niger stadium, where they brought together like 30,000 people and they did this kind of dog and pony show for, the military government, and there were Russian flags everywhere. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. And they're perfectly clean. They're beautiful. They're brand new.
You just kind of wonder, is it the Russian embassy just ready with a stockpile of flag ready to distribute them?
And, you want a flag, you get a flag. You want a flag, you get a flag. I mean, there's something to be learned there. But a little side note on the French-Chinese relationship in Africa. And while at the same time I indicated that the Chinese do like to see the French in retreat in terms of political influence in Africa, I think it benefits them. I think you and I both agree on that.
Yeah.
It just gives the Chinese more room to maneuver, and that's the ultimate benefit for them. But at the same time, the Chinese work more collaboratively with the French than any other Western government in Africa. And really, more than the U.S. I mean, certainly there's nothing going with the U.S., but certainly more than any European government, more than any G7 power. So there are $1.6 billion were agreed upon between the French and Chinese governments to do development projects. I think they're between 5 and 7 of these joint development projects. Also, the Chinese and the French worked together in the private sector. The CMA, the big shipping company, helped to develop the port of Lekki in Nigeria. And then we have the ECOP, the controversial East African crude oil pipeline that is being jointly built between Total Energy, which is a French oil company, CNOOC, the Chinese oil company, and the Ugandan government. And so it's interesting to show how the French do have this ability to work more collaboratively with the Chinese than, again, any other major power. And when US and UK and other governments ask us, they say, how can we work collaboratively with the Chinese? And people do ask these questions, believe it or not. One of the pieces of feedback that we give is to say, look at what the French are doing. Just take a look at what they're doing. And I always love it in those conferences that we participate in when we bring up that issue, because the French and the Chinese do get along better on this front than anybody else. And that is interesting and I think important to note.
Exactly. And in that regard, we have to kind of congratulate Emmanuel Macron, because I have to admit, he has that goal list, the goal kind of feeling of like France needs to stand alone by itself in terms of its foreign policy. And France doesn't need to bandwagon to the US when it comes to the relationship with China. And in Europe, France is really trying to stand and to say, I'm going to deal with China when it's needed. I'm going to confront him when it's needed. But in that context, in many projects in Africa, we see how much France are more willing and pragmatical in the relationship with China, ready to work together, ready to invest with different projects. You mentioned Africa. We also see the same situation in many Latin American projects in mining industry, where you see French companies working with Chinese companies. So France has that pragmatic approach to China. And I think China do kind of appreciate the fact that France also has that pragmatism when it comes to working with China in Europe or even in Africa. And I think it's because of that many do believe that China has no interest into peddling the anti-France feeling in Africa. They can take opportunity, they can seize the opportunity when a situation like this arises, but they cannot be there peddling and forcing the issue of the anti-France feeling, because, when they do that, they're going to antagonize themselves toward France in Europe, when somehow they really need a strong voice in Europe that can, talk with them and talk for them if needed in Europe. So because of that, I think it's also reinforced the reason why China was like, we hope to find a much more peaceful solution in Niger, because they do know how much Niger is also important to France. But when I say Niger is important to France, I like to make a note here. I've seen many people talking about the uranium, and I think you even mentioned that how much Niger produces uranium, and people kind of to conflate and to exaggerate the importance of Niger today to France in terms of uranium. Today Niger provide the 6th or 7th supply of France uranium, and it's only 4% of the world uranium. So it's not really that geopolitical, geostrategic uranium situation that's in play here. So keeping that in mind, when you look at all the picture, you understand why China is more, amicable and hoping to find a peaceful solution in Niger.
So it's not cobalt in the Congo, for example?
No, it's not really cobalt in Congo.
Well, let's step back now just and close our discussion just with some reflections. And one of my biggest takeaways of this for the Chinese is that these coups, all of them that have been happening, I think set back the entire African continent in the eyes of the Chinese. And let's go beyond just the Chinese government. And what I'm going to say, I think, is going to be a surprise to a lot of people who don't follow the issue as closely as we do. But one of the things that we've been tracking over the past few years, how China's interest in Africa has been steadily fading over the past few years. And we look at this in terms of trade. So when you look at the absolute amount of trade between China and Africa, the number has gone up. But the relative share of China's total global trade, African trade is flat or it's gone down. Africa remains at the very bottom of China's regional global trading partners, really close to Oceania. Those are the South Pacific islands. So this 282, 283 billion, which is on track for again this year, which is what they did last year, is a really small number. And when you consider that the bulk of Chinese trade with Africa is largely concentrated in 5 countries, both for imports and exports, you see how truly distorted this economic relationship is. Chinese commodity buying has shifted away from Africa, with the exception of the strategic resources in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. But for oil, mineral, and timber, what the Chinese depended on Africa in the early 2000s, now they've got the Belt and Road, they've got Russia, they've got the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, all of those places, and they can buy in much larger quantities. What these coups do is they add to the perception that Africa is a risk. Africa is unstable. Africa is just too much trouble. Forget it. I can do much better business in Brazil. I don't have to deal with military coups, political instability. I don't have to deal with my personnel being locked down as they are in Niamey right now. You know what? Forget it. And I think there is a reputational cost that extends across the entire continent. And it's unfortunate. It adds to the prejudice that exists in terms of Africa and the risk premiums that are unimaginably higher for Africa, for the rest of the continent. The problems in the Sahel do not impact, places thousands of kilometers away, but yet everybody gets thrown into the same basket. And I think this is only going to contribute to a further retreat of the Chinese in Africa, and I think it's a major setback. What are your final thoughts?
You said it all. You said it all. I couldn't even agree more, because it's exactly that. People don't realize that when China sees that, it's more like, okay, guys, if we have to lend money to those countries, we have to add up our own risk premium. And the kind of risk premium that Chinese lenders are going to add up on those loans are going to be the kind of where people are going to talk about the debt trap narrative and everything. But the reality, it's more of the expression of Chinese worriedness about how Africa is managed. The new regime can come into power and say, we are pro-China, we are pro-Russia. For China, it doesn't change much. For China, it just means that we cannot really rely on you, because the way you came into power, it means that the same way you can also leave power. And in that context, we cannot really just come and pull billions in terms of loan in your country or even in the region without being sure that then what's going to happen in the next 5-10 years. So in that context, yes, what you said is very right on point. And I do believe that Africa should really stop encouraging those coups, those military coups. Beyond the military coup, even the political, the constitutional coup, where we see president changing the laws, changing constitution to remain in power, creating much more instability, creating much more reason to have coups and instability in the future. I think we should become more focused into what we need to do as Africans to change the reputation of our country, to improve governance, to improve stability. And if we don't do that, China's and the rest of the country, even Russia, who are coming for its own interests, let's not forget that. They're not coming because they like Africa, they're coming because their own interests. When they come, they see us the same way. Africa is a risky business, is a risky place. They're not crazy, they're not stupid. They see how we behaved toward colonial power before. They do know that when we come to Africa, we're going to have to put in place our own measure in a way that whatever investment we are going to do there, we are going to take the money back and fast without, the risk that comes with it. So yeah, we need to do a lot and we need to do better than that. So yeah, I think that's going to be my final thought on that crisis in Niger.
Well, if this is an issue that interests you, and if you want to hear from a Francophone African perspective, then Geraud and the work he's doing at the Projet Afrique Chine, you can follow them on our website. Just go to the top of our website at China Global South, and you'll see Francais there. If you speak French, you will see all of this coverage in French. We are the only service in the world that's providing daily coverage of what's happening in Francophone Africa. Geraud's got a fantastic podcast. He's running the Afrique Chine, that's Afrique with a K, Chine Twitter feed as well. And Geraud, I just want to make sure that we draw some attention to the incredible work that you and a team of researchers have done in mapping, for the very first time, the entire cobalt supply chain in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you are from. Very quickly, let's just talk about that. Give us a little bit of an update as to how that's going and what the reaction's been as you've now had a chance to present it to key stakeholders around the world.
That's very good news. For those who've been following us, you know that a few weeks back, we announced that we're going to put it online. Yes, our baby is online. Our tool is online. We are really happy to announce that. So it's available both in French and in English. In English, you're going to find it in ChinaGlobalSouth.com, special reports. You're going to see the map. In that tool, you're going to find basically every information you know about the major producer of cobalt and coppers in the DRC. Where do they sell it to? Who buy it from them? Where do they ship it? What route do they take? How much they've produced, or how much money those transactions of copper and cobalt had happened in the DRC over the last 5 years. So we kind of gather those information, allowing people to have a global view who are the major powers and the stakeholders in the cobalt industry in the DRC. It's very important. So we want to provide people with the tool and to kind of have very foundation-based and factual-based discussion when they talk about those topics, so they kind of know where things are standing. What's already the reaction so far? The reaction have been really positive. We've had presentation with different stakeholders, with different research centers, with policymakers who are really happy about the tool. We keep on receiving requests of having talks to explain to them what the tool is about, what were our findings. And I think I'm going to have to record another podcast where we're going to be explaining the different findings that we found during those research. So yeah, it was really positive. So I would invite our auditors to go on ChinaGlobalSouth.com, special reports, to find the tool. The same things are in French, so you're going to find the tool, and it's very interesting. Don't hesitate to contact us to have more clarification or question if needed be.
Yeah, we love talking with people about this. It's so exciting. So if you want to reach out to Geraud directly, cgneema@ChinaGlobalSouth.com is his email address. If you want to reach me, Eric, ERIC, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you want to see the fantastic work again that Geraud did with his team, go to either the homepage in French or in English. We've got big banners right there on the homepage, which will take you to the interactive map. You can also find us in the special reports tab that we've launched on the site. And by the way, we're working on a whole bunch of other new data projects. We're going to be mapping out all of China's green energy initiatives in Africa. We're also now starting on a project at mapping out the nickel supply chain in Indonesia as well. So some very cool things that are in the pipeline. If you are interested in all of the great work that everybody's doing at the China Global South Project in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, we would love for you to support our work and for you to be able to access everything that we're doing with a subscription to the China Global South Project. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You'll get a free 30-day trial just to see if you like it. If you are a student or a teacher, email me, again, Eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I'll send you a link for a 50% discount so you can sign up to receive us. And you can join thousands of readers around the world in many governments, think tanks, universities, and even our friends at the IMF and the World Bank, Geraud, are subscribers. So if you work for the IMF and the World Bank, you have unlimited access to everything that we are doing. Let's leave the conversation there. Geraud, me, Cobus, the whole team will be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. For Geraud, Neema, and Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.